Auntie Quat's heart leaped with joy the moment she first held her baby girl, Nkunim. The midwife smiled warmly, placing the tiny bundle in her arms. For years, Quat had prayed for this moment, and now, her miracle was finally here. But as quickly as the joy arrived, it was overshadowed by devastating news. The doctor's words were clinical, almost cold. "We had to remove your womb due to complications. Severe postpartum hemorrhage. You won't be able to have more children." Quat's world crumbled. She had envisioned a bustling household filled with the laughter of many children. Now, her dreams were reduced to this one fragile life in her arms. She looked down at Nkunim and vowed, through her tears, to pour every ounce of love and care into her only child. Her husband, Pa Kwazi, stood silently in the corner, his face unreadable. Though he loved Quat and the baby, the thought of having just one child gnawed at him. In their culture, children were not just blessings, they were insurance for the future. The more children a man had, the greater his legacy. Quat, however, refused to dwell on what was lost. She focused entirely on Nkunim, raising her with unwavering determination despite their modest means. But little did she know, the bond she cherished would one day be tested in ways she could never imagine. Pa Kwazi watched from the doorway as Quat cradled Nkunim in her arms, singing a lullaby in a soft, trembling voice. The flickering oil lamp cast long shadows across the room, its dim light reflecting the stark reality of their modest life. While Quat seemed content with their little family, Pa Kwazi's mind wandered to the expectations of his community. In their village, a man's worth was often measured by the size of his household. Other men boasted about their growing children, the boys who would till the fields and the girls who would marry into prosperous families. Pa Kwazi had only Nkunim, a baby girl. He never voiced his thoughts, afraid of hurting Quat. She had already endured enough, and he couldn't deny that she was a devoted mother. But his resentment simmered beneath the surface, growing stronger with each passing day. As Nkunim grew, she brought joy to her mother's heart but failed to fill the void in Pa Kwazi's. He loved her, but it wasn't the same as the pride he imagined he'd feel with a house full of children. When Quat suggested that they work harder to give Nkunim a good education, Pa Kwazi reluctantly agreed. "She's just one child, Quat," he muttered one evening as they prepared dinner. "Why stretch ourselves so thin?" "Because she is all we have," Quat replied firmly, her voice tinged with desperation. "If we don't give her a future, who will?" Pa Kwazi sighed and nodded, but in his heart, he wondered if the sacrifices would ever be worth it. Nkunim blossomed into a lively and intelligent child, with an insatiable curiosity that often surprised her parents. She was the star pupil in the village school, always returning home with high marks and stories of her achievements. Quat beamed with pride as she watched her daughter excel. She worked tirelessly, doing everything from selling fruits in the market to taking up sewing jobs for wealthier villagers. Whatever it took to keep Nkunim in school, Quat was willing to do. Pa Kwazi, though still distant, couldn't help but feel a flicker of pride when neighbors praised his daughter. "Your Nkunim will go far," they'd say, patting him on the back. He smiled in response, though his heart remained heavy with the weight of his unspoken regrets. One day, Nkunim came home with a letter in hand, her face glowing with excitement. "Mama, Baba, I've been selected for a scholarship to study in the city," she exclaimed, waving the paper. Quat's knees nearly gave way as she sank to the ground in gratitude. "God is good," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You see, Kwazi, our sacrifices are paying off." But Pa Kwazi's expression remained neutral. The city meant that Nkunim would leave them, and though he didn't say it, he feared that she might never return. The day of Nkunim's departure arrived with a mixture of joy and sorrow. Quat packed her daughter's few belongings in an old suitcase, adding small comforts, a handmade scarf, dried plantain chips, and a Bible. She hugged Nkunim tightly, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Never forget where you come from, my child." "I won't, Mama," Nkunim promised, though her heart was already racing with excitement about the new life ahead. The journey to the city was long and overwhelming. For Nkunim, it felt like stepping into another world. The towering buildings, bustling streets, and bright lights were a stark contrast to the quiet simplicity of her village. She arrived at the university with wide eyes and a hopeful heart. Her new roommates were friendly but came from wealthy families, and their conversations were peppered with tales of luxury, weekend trips abroad, designer clothes, and extravagant parties. Nkunim felt out of place, but she quickly learned to adapt. When her roommates asked about her family, she avoided mentioning her rural roots. "My parents are in the trade business," she lied, hoping to blend in. Over time, Nkunim's transformation began. She started dressing differently, speaking more confidently, and distancing herself from her past. But in doing so, she also began to distance herself from the very people who had sacrificed everything for her. In the city, Nkunim thrived academically and socially. Her intelligence earned her the admiration of her professors, while her newfound style and charm attracted the attention of her peers. She quickly became one of the most popular students on campus, but with popularity came pressure. Nkunim felt the need to maintain an image of sophistication, which meant concealing her humble beginnings. She stopped taking her mother's calls in public, fearing that her friends might overhear Quat's thick village accent. Her mother, unaware of the growing distance, continued to send money and messages of encouragement. "We are so proud of you," Quat wrote in one letter. "Your hard work inspires us every day." Nkunim read the letters with a pang of guilt, but pushed the feeling aside. "I'll make it up to her once I'm successful," she told herself. As the weeks turned into months, Nkunim became a different person, one who was ashamed of the very roots that had nurtured her. Little did she know, her past was about to catch up with her in the most unexpected way. Nkunim sat with her friends at a trendy cafe near campus, laughing and sharing stories about their lives. Her friends talked about vacations in Paris, shopping sprees in Dubai, and their parents' flourishing businesses. "What about you, Nkunim?" one of them asked, sipping her latte. "You've never really told us much about your family." Nkunim hesitated. She had rehearsed this moment many times, crafting a version of her life that fit the glamorous image she wanted to project. "Oh, my parents are entrepreneurs," she said casually. "They trade goods and travel often. I grew up pretty independent." Her friends nodded approvingly, impressed. The lie was small, but it weighed heavily on Nkunim. She justified it by telling herself that her background didn't matter. What mattered was where she was headed. But as the days passed, the small lies grew into a web of deceit. Nkunim avoided speaking to her mother in front of others, ignored her father's calls entirely, and sent brief, dismissive replies to her mother's heartfelt messages. She didn't realize that each of these actions was driving a wedge deeper into their bond. Back in the village, Quat worked tirelessly to support her daughter's dreams. Her hands were calloused from hours of farm work, and her back ached from carrying heavy loads to the market. Despite her struggles, she never complained. "This is for Nkunim," she would say to herself, wiping sweat from her brow. "She's going to have a better life than I ever could." Quat's neighbors often marveled at her dedication. "You're raising a star, Quat," one woman said. "She'll bring honor to this village." Quat smiled at the words, but her heart ached with longing to see her daughter. Nkunim's calls had become infrequent, and when they did speak, the conversations were brief and rushed. Still, Quat brushed aside her concerns, believing that Nkunim was simply busy with her studies. What Quat didn't know was that her daughter's life in the city had taken a turn she could never have imagined. One sunny afternoon, Quat decided to surprise her daughter. She had saved enough money to make the journey to the city and had packed a basket of farm produce, fresh yams, ripe bananas, and a jar of homemade palm oil. The journey was long and exhausting, but Quat's excitement kept her going. As she arrived at the university gates, she looked around in awe. The tall buildings and bustling students were a far cry from the quiet fields she was used to. Quat approached a group of students and asked for directions to Nkunim's dormitory. "She's my daughter," she said proudly, clutching the basket tightly. One of the students pointed her in the right direction, and Quat's heart raced as she climbed the steps to the dorm. When she finally saw Nkunim in the distance, her face lit up with joy. "Nkunim," she called out, waving. Nkunim froze. She was with a group of her friends, and the sight of her mother, dressed in her worn village clothes and carrying a basket, sent a jolt of panic through her. Her friends turned to look, curious about the woman who had called her name. "Who is that?" one of them asked. Nkunim hesitated for a moment that felt like an eternity. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I don't know. Maybe she's mistaken." The word struck Kwat like a physical blow. She stopped in her tracks, her smile fading as confusion and hurt washed over her face. "Nkunim, it's me," she said, her voice trembling. "It's your mother." But Nkunim turned away, pretending not to hear. Her friend shrugged and moved on, leaving Kwat standing alone in the hallway, her basket of gifts feeling heavier than ever. Kwat returned to the village that evening, her heart shattered. She sat alone in her small home, staring at the basket she had brought back with her. Tears streamed down her face as she cried out to the heavens. "Why, God? Why has my own child turned her back on me after all I have done for her?" Kwat's cries echoed through the night, filled with pain and anguish. In her grief, she muttered words that she didn't fully understand the weight of. "May she feel the pain she has caused me. May she know what it's like to be abandoned." Her neighbors heard her cries, but dared not approach. They whispered among themselves, wondering what could have driven Kwat to such despair. Little did anyone know, those words, spoken in a moment of deep sorrow, would set off a chain of events that would change Nkunim's life forever. Back in the city, Nkunim tried to carry on as if nothing had happened. She convinced herself that denying her mother was necessary to maintain her reputation. "It's not like she'll understand my life here," she told herself. But despite her rationalizations, guilt began to creep into her thoughts, and with it, something darker. A few days later, Nkunim was called to the university's administrative office. "We regret to inform you," the clerk began, her tone clipped, "that your scholarship has been revoked due to a procedural review." "What?" Nkunim's voice wavered. "That can't be right. I've been meeting all the requirements." "I'm afraid the decision is final," the clerk said, sliding a letter across the desk. "You'll have to find alternative funding if you wish to continue your studies." Nkunim left the office in a daze. Her scholarship was her lifeline. It paid for her tuition, her accommodation, and even part of her living expenses. Without it, she had no way to stay at the university. Her attempts to reach out to sponsors and appeal the decision were met with rejection. One by one, the doors that had seemed wide open began to slam shut. As if losing her scholarship wasn't enough, Nkunim's troubles began to multiply. A week after the scholarship news, her roommate accused her of borrowing money and failing to pay it back. Though the accusation was false, it spread through campus, tarnishing her reputation. Her friendships crumbled. The same people who had once admired her now avoided her, whispering behind her back. Without her scholarship, Nkunim struggled to pay her rent, and soon, she was evicted from her dormitory. She tried to hide her struggles from her mother, refusing to call or visit. But her pride couldn't shield her from the growing weight of her problems. One evening, as she walked through the campus with her few belongings, she stumbled and fell. As she sat on the pavement, tears streaming down her face, she realized how far she had fallen. That night, Nkunim was haunted by a dream. She saw her mother standing in the village, tears streaming down her face as she cried out, "Nkunim, why have you turned away from me?" The image jolted her awake, and she sat up in bed, her chest heaving. For the first time, Nkunim allowed herself to feel the full weight of her guilt. She thought about everything her mother had done for her. The sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the unwavering love. She tried to call her mother, but the phone rang and rang without an answer. Each unanswered ring felt like a dagger to her heart. Desperate, Nkunim sent a long text message to her mother, apologizing for her actions and begging for forgiveness. She waited anxiously for a reply, but none came. Days turned into weeks, and still, there was no word from Kwat. Nkunim began to fear the worst. She thought about returning to the village but hesitated, unsure if she would even be welcome. Her life in the city continued to spiral out of control. Without money or support, she struggled to find food and a place to sleep. Each passing day chipped away at her once confident exterior, leaving her vulnerable and broken. Finally, Nkunim made the decision to return to the village. She packed what little she had left and boarded the rickety bus that would take her back to the place she had once been so eager to leave behind. As the bus pulled into the village, she felt a wave of apprehension. The familiar sights, the dusty roads, the small market stalls, the old well, were now tinged with the shame of her actions. When she arrived at her mother's home, she found it empty. A neighbor approached and said, "What hasn't been herself lately? She stays in most days, refusing to talk to anyone. You'll find her inside." Kunim hesitated before stepping through the door. The sight of her mother, frail and tired, brought tears to her eyes. Kwat looked up, and their eyes met. "Mama!" Kunim's voice cracked as she knelt before her mother. "I'm sorry. I failed you." Kwat said nothing at first. She simply looked at her daughter, her expression a mix of pain and longing. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling. "You turned your back on me, Kunim. Do you know what that did to me?" Kunim broke down, unable to hold back her tears. "I was wrong, Mama. I was so wrong. Please, forgive me." The confrontation was raw and emotional. Kwat poured out all her pain, the humiliation of being denied, the loneliness of not hearing from her daughter, and the sorrow of feeling unappreciated. "I gave everything for you, Kunim," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I never thought my own child would bring me so much shame." Kunim listened, her heart breaking with every word. She realized that her mother's hurt went deeper than she could have imagined. For the first time, she saw the full extent of the pain she had caused. "I'll do whatever it takes to make it up to you, Mama," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Just give me a chance." Kwat sighed heavily, her shoulders sagging under the weight of her grief. "You'll have to earn my trust again, Kunim. It won't be easy." The tension in Kwat's small home was palpable. After their emotional confrontation, Kunim stayed, hoping to repair the bond she had broken. But the silence between mother and daughter was heavy, filled with unspoken words and lingering pain. Kwat, though deeply hurt, couldn't fully turn her back on her daughter. Despite everything, she was still a mother, and her love for Kunim couldn't simply disappear. However, she wasn't ready to forgive. Early one morning, Kwat rose and began her daily chores, sweeping the compound, fetching water from the village well, and tending to her small garden. Kunim watched her from the doorway, guilt tightening in her chest. She knew she had to do more than apologize. She had to show her mother she was sincere. "Let me help you, Mama," Kunim said hesitantly, stepping into the yard. Kwat glanced at her but didn't respond. Instead, she handed Kunim a hoe and pointed to a patch of weeds. "If you want to help, start there." For the next few hours, Kunim worked under the scorching sun, her hands blistering and her back aching. She hadn't done physical labor since she left the village, and her body wasn't used to it, but she pushed through, determined to prove herself. As the days passed, Kunim took on more tasks, from selling produce at the market to cooking meals. Slowly, Kwat began to see glimpses of the daughter she had once been so proud of. Still, her heart remained guarded. News of Kunim's return spread quickly through the village. The once celebrated girl who had left for the city in a blaze of glory was now back, humbled and struggling. "Did you hear? Kwat's daughter is back," one woman whispered to another at the market. "I heard she lost her scholarship and had to come home," another replied. Imagine, after all the sacrifices her mother made. The gossip stung Kunim, but she kept her head down, focusing on rebuilding her relationship with her mother. She avoided the judgmental stares and the murmured conversations, knowing she had to face the consequences of her actions. Kwat, too, bore the brunt of the whispers. While some villagers sympathized with her, others criticized her for spoiling Kunim. Maybe if she hadn't treated her like a queen, she wouldn't have turned out this way, they said. Despite the hurtful words, Kwat remained silent, channeling her energy into her work and her strained relationship with Kunim. One evening, as they sat together in the dimly lit kitchen, Kunim finally broke the silence. "Mama, I don't know if I can ever make things right," she said, her voice trembling. "I've hurt you so much. Sometimes, I wonder if I even deserve your forgiveness." Kwat looked at her daughter, her expression softening for the first time in weeks. "Kunim," she began, "forgiveness is not about whether you deserve it. It's about whether I'm willing to let go of the pain you've caused me." And that takes time. Nkunim nodded, tears welling in her eyes. She thought about all the ways she had betrayed her mother's trust, denying her in public, ignoring her calls, and abandoning the values Quad had worked so hard to instill in her. That night, Nkunim lay awake, replaying the events of the past year in her mind. She thought about her choices, her pride, and the person she had become. For the first time, she felt a deep desire to change, not for her own sake, but for her mother's. Determined to start fresh, Nkunim began seeking ways to rebuild her life. She approached a local teacher, Mr. Kofi, who was known for helping young people in the village. "I want to teach, sir," she said. "I want to give back to the children here and make a difference." Mr. Kofi was skeptical at first. "Teaching isn't easy, Nkunim," he said. "It requires patience, dedication, and a willingness to learn. Are you ready for that?" "Yes," Nkunim replied firmly. "I want to do this. Please, give me a chance." With Mr. Kofi's guidance, Nkunim began assisting in the village school. She quickly realized how much she enjoyed working with the children, helping them with their lessons and encouraging them to dream big. Quat watched her daughter's transformation with cautious optimism. Though she was proud of Nkunim's efforts, she still struggled to fully trust her. But seeing Nkunim interact with the children gave her a glimmer of hope. One day, as Nkunim walked home from the school, she passed by a group of villagers who were deep in conversation. When they saw her, they fell silent, their expressions unreadable. "Good evening," Nkunim said politely, her heart pounding. One of the women, an elder named Auntie Ajoa, stepped forward. "You've changed, Nkunim," she said, her tone thoughtful. "We see it. Your mother sees it. But do you see it?" Nkunim hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "I'm trying to be better," she said finally. Auntie Ajoa nodded. "Keep trying. And never forget where you come from. Your mother has been through so much for you. Honor her." The words stayed with Nkunim as she continued home. That evening, she sat with her mother and shared her plans for the future. "I want to save up and go back to school one day, Mama," she said. "But this time, I'll do it right. I'll work hard, and I'll make you proud." Quat looked at her daughter, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You already are, Nkunim," she said softly. "But remember, pride is a dangerous thing. Never let it blind you again." For the first time in months, Nkunim felt a sense of peace. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she was ready to face it, with her mother by her side. Nkunim's journey toward redemption was not without challenges. Working at the village school brought her closer to the community, but it also tested her resolve. Some villagers remained skeptical of her transformation, watching her every move for signs of failure. One day, during a lesson, a young boy named Kwame refused to participate in class. He sat at the back of the room, his arms crossed, glaring at the chalkboard. "Kwame, why aren't you writing?" Nkunim asked gently. "I don't want to," he replied defiantly. The other children snickered, but Nkunim remained calm. She crouched beside Kwame's desk and lowered her voice. "Why don't you want to? Is something bothering you?" Kwame hesitated, then mumbled, "It doesn't matter. I'm not smart like the others." Nkunim's heart sank. She saw herself in Kwame, the fear of not being good enough, the weight of expectations. She spent the rest of the lesson giving him extra attention, encouraging him to try, no matter how small the effort. By the end of the day, Kwame had written his first full sentence on the chalkboard. The experience taught Nkunim an important lesson. Rebuilding herself wasn't just about gaining her mother's trust. It was about becoming someone who could uplift others, just as her mother had done for her. Weeks turned into months, and Nkunim began to feel more at home in the village. Her relationship with Quad improved steadily, though the scars of their past lingered. One afternoon, as she was returning from the school, she noticed a sleek car parked outside her mother's house. It was an unusual sight in their humble village, and it immediately filled her with unease. Inside, she found a man in a sharp suit seated across from Quat. He turned to face her, and she froze. It was Mr. Mensa, a businessman she had met during her time in the city. "Nkunim," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's been a while." "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice tight. Mr. Mensa leaned back, his expression smug. "I came to discuss an opportunity with your mother." but I couldn't resist seeing how the mighty have fallen. Quat looked between them, confused. Who is this man, Cunham? He's no one, Mama, Cunham said quickly. But Mr. Minsa wasn't finished. She used to run with the city crowd, he said, addressing Quat. Always the life of the party, always too proud to admit where she came from. Quat's face darkened. Is this true, Cunham? Cunham swallowed hard, her past threatening to undo everything she had worked for. She nodded reluctantly. It's true, Mama. I made mistakes, but I'm not that person anymore. Quat stood and faced Mr. Minsa, her voice firm. My daughter may have stumbled, but she's finding her way back. You have no business here. Leave. Mr. Minsa smirked but obeyed, walking out without another word. Cunham felt a wave of relief, but also a renewed determination to prove to her mother and herself that she had truly changed. After Mr. Minsa's departure, Quat and Cunham sat together in silence. Finally, Quat spoke. You've been through a lot, haven't you? Cunham nodded. More than I ever imagined. But it's my fault, Mama. I thought I could leave this village and forget where I came from. I thought I didn't need anyone. I was wrong. Quat reached out and took Cunham's hand. It's not wrong to want more for yourself, Cunham, but you must never forget your roots. They're what ground you, even when the world feels unstable. Tears filled Cunham's eyes as she felt the weight of her mother's words. For the first time, she realized that forgiveness wasn't just about earning her mother's trust. It was about forgiving herself for her mistakes and moving forward. I'm proud of the woman you're becoming, Quat said softly. You still have a long way to go, but I see your effort. And for that, you have my blessing. The words felt like a balm to Cunham's soul. She vowed to carry her mother's blessing with her in everything she did. Not long after, Cunham was approached by Mr. Kofi, the village teacher who had taken her under his wing. He told her about a government initiative that offered scholarships for individuals willing to train as teachers in rural areas. It's a competitive program, he said, but I think you have a good chance. You've proven your dedication here. The idea both excited and terrified Cunham. Returning to formal education meant leaving the village again, a prospect that brought back memories of her previous failures. What if I'm not good enough? She asked Quat that evening. Quat smiled and placed a hand on her shoulder. You've always been good enough, Cunham. You just need to believe it. And this time, don't forget where you come from. Encouraged by her mother's words, Cunham applied for the program. The waiting period was nerve-wracking, but she used the time to continue teaching and helping in the community. When the acceptance letter finally arrived, Cunham felt a surge of emotion, pride, relief, and a renewed sense of purpose. I'll make you proud, Mama, she said as she hugged Quat tightly. You already have, Quat replied, tears streaming down her face.